Hello again, everyone, and welcome to the July edition of VolunteerMatch Solutions Best Practice Network webinar series. I'm Casey Brennan from VolunteerMatch, and will be moderating the session today. Today we're joined by Julie Dixon, who's the Deputy Director of the Center for Social Impact Communication at Georgetown University. Julie recently led a research study exploring how small businesses think about CSR, social media, and the intersection of these two important practices. So we're really lucky to have her here today to kind of lead us through the findings of the research, share recommendations for how cash-strapped small businesses can looking to share their CSR stories online, and tips for them to do so. Before we get started, I wanted to give you a couple of reminders. First, you can ask questions in two ways today. You can type them throughout the session in the question box on the right-hand side of your screen, or you can also submit questions to us on Twitter using the hashtag VMBPN and sending that to @VM_solution. And we're happy to take any questions, and we're going to post those at the end of Julie's presentation today. And just as a reminder, a copy of these slides and a recording of this session will be distributed after the event, so you will surely get all the notes you need to bring your program to life after the session. So without further delay, I'm now going to hand the presentation over to Julie. Julie, welcome.
Thank you, Casey. Thanks so much for the introduction, and thank you, VolunteerMatch, for having me here today. Welcome to everyone on the call. Good morning, good afternoon. I'm so excited to have the opportunity here today to share with you some of the findings of our research that Casey talked about, and I really hope that you'll find it helpful as you think about your own challenges in using social media to talk about your CSR stories. So before I get into the research and some of the tips and recommendations, I wanted to just give you a quick overview of the center and some of the work that we do in case you're not familiar with us. As Casey mentioned, I manage Georgetown's Center for Social Impact Communication. And we have been in existence for just about 5 years now, and we are a part of the master's program in public relations and corporate communications here at the university. And we are really the only academic initiative of its kind in the country, in that we focus not just on CSR or nonprofit management or cause marketing in general, but we really look specifically at the role of communications and of communicators in fostering engagement and social change across each of those different areas and across the overlap. So we really work to help shape the conversation about how you can communicate about impact in a way that is authentic, that is transparent, and that's really engaging. So you can check out more about the center and follow along with our work. There's a couple links up there to our website and to our Twitter handle. And I look forward to hopefully connecting with each of you at some point after the call. So to give you a quick overview of the research, we have a number of different research projects up and running at any given time, and we work with our graduate students in a number of different ways. But the research that I'm sharing with you today is part of the most recent white paper that we published called Small Business, Big Engagement. And it really looks at trends and best practices in using social media to tell the small business CSR story. And we wanted to look at small businesses in particular because there's starting to be a lot more done in the area of what large companies can do on social media and in the realm of CSR, but not so much about small businesses in particular, and they face a unique set of limitations in respect to the size of the staff and the resources and the budget that they're dealing with. So we thought it was worth spending the time to see what some of the innovators are doing in that space and what lessons we can take away from them. So what we did is we interviewed 12 different small and medium-sized businesses here in the greater DC area, and we chose each of the businesses for very specific reasons, mostly because of their demonstrated success or their leadership in community involvement, volunteerism here in the area. So either they were recognized with awards, or they belong to coalitions or associations that are pushing the envelope on responsible or sustainable business in the area. And we spoke to each of them at length about what are some of their motivations for the community involvement work that they do, how do they communicate about it, who do they communicate about it with, and how does social media factor into this whole process. So combined with that, we took a look at all of the channels that they were using to communicate about their CSR and community involvement online. So that includes their websites, their blogs, Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, etc., to see what platforms were they using, what were they saying, how were they saying it, and what kind of successes and engagement and results were they seeing. And then finally, we also looked at a number of the existing studies and stuff that's out there on CSR communications and social media in general, just to see what some of the larger companies are doing and what trends there are, to kind of see if there are any takeaways and learnings that could be applied to the small businesses. So that's kind of a quick overview of what went into the development of the paper, and you can download a copy of it on our website. It's pretty lengthy and there's a lot of information packed in there, but it's worth a read. So what we're going to cover today. So when I was putting together my slides, I figured in honor of the Olympics, I would take an Olympic theme. So that's what you'll see throughout the webinar. So what I want to do is kind of picture us as a small business at the starting line there with a bunch of hurdles in front of us. And what I want to talk through are what some of those common hurdles are that small businesses have to overcome when they're telling their CSR stories via social media, some tips of how to do it effectively, and perhaps most importantly, particularly for smaller organizations, how do you really sustain it in the long run, given some of those unique limitations on resources and staff and budgets that can make some of the strategies that work for larger companies maybe not quite as appropriate for smaller organizations. So we'll talk through what that looks like. So before I get into some of the hurdles and tips, I want to take a second and really clarify what we talk about when we say engagement, because it's a term that gets thrown around pretty often these days, and there are a lot of different ways that it can be defined. So for the purposes of our research and what we think small businesses can really hope to achieve with social media and CSR, I'm taking engagement to really just mean a relationship. It's a two-way participatory conversation. It means when you post something on Facebook or Twitter or whatever social media platform that you're using, that you're getting something back from people. There's interactivity, there's some action that somebody is taking. They're not just passively absorbing the information, but they're actually doing something in response to that information. So, when you hear engagement throughout the slides, just kind of keep that in the back of your mind. So our first hurdle, and this is, this applies whether you're a small business or a large business, but in particular, what we heard from a lot of the organizations that we were talking to is that there's this reluctance to tell people about the good work that they're doing. I'm going to throw a couple of statistics out, true to my status as an academic here, as a way of sort of comparing the attitudes and the behaviors of large and small businesses. And these are from a 2009 study by the Boston College Center for Corporate Citizenship. In it, they surveyed groups from small businesses, medium businesses, and larger businesses, and were able to break out kind of attitudes and beliefs for each of those different groups. And one of the questions they asked were, how much do you communicate externally about CSR? And what they found was that only 30% of small businesses were actively communicating externally versus 59% of larger businesses. So granted, these statistics are a couple of years old, but I think that gap between the two, I would expect that still holds true today. And at the same time, 73% of the small businesses surveyed said that there's way more CSR going on than people realize. So, they acknowledge that there's a lot that's being done, but are still sort of reluctant to share that with people. I came across a great term the other day that kind of describes this reluctance to communicate about CSR sustainability, and I wanted to share that on the call today, and it's called green blushing. And I thought this was so cool. It's sort of the flip side of greenwashing, which is a pretty well-known term, where maybe you're talking a good game, but you actually have little to no action to back it up. Well, green blushing is just the opposite. You actually do have lots to say. You have a lot of stories to tell and a lot of really significant impact to report, but for whatever reason, there's still this hesitance to share these with wider audiences. So I actually want to quickly do a poll here to see if anybody on the call, if you've ever been reluctant to share your stories with your external stakeholders, and if so, what some of those reasons might be.
So for everyone on the call, you can select your responses on your screen now. I'm going to keep it open for about 20 more seconds so we can make sure to get everyone's responses, and then we'll show you the results of what everyone in the audience thinks.
So you can see some of the common reasons that we heard when we were talking to our small businesses here in this list. I know that being perceived as bragging came up during last month's webinar with the folks from Fenton, and that's also something that we hear a lot of from our small businesses. There's also the question of what your motives are. You don't want to appear like you're only in it for the publicity, so to speak, or that you're somehow exploiting the work that you're doing or the problems that you're trying to address in the community. Or there's also that fear that, if you pick a cause and you put yourself out there, that people won't all be in favor of the cause that you're, putting your resources behind.
All right, I'm going to go ahead and close the poll now and show everyone the results.
Great. Well, I'm glad to see that so many people on the call have never been reelected. That's excellent. Yeah, I mean, that's pretty much in line with, with what we're seeing. And what I think is one of the interesting things as well, what we saw in the research is that small businesses tend to be a bit of a tougher sell than larger companies when it comes to looking at others' CSR communications, so not just their own, but looking at some of their peers. They tend to be more skeptical of motives. And I think that's in line with what we're seeing here. In that same Boston College survey that I mentioned earlier, 59% of the small businesses that were surveyed agreed that, companies communicate about it, but they may lack that true deep commitment to CSR. And this figure for small businesses was significantly higher than among larger companies. So, perhaps if they look skeptically at other companies, then they're more likely to think that people are looking the same way at them. And then they're, somewhat reluctant to talk about what they're doing. So I'm going to go to my next slide here. So the question is, why should you communicate? Is there a responsibility that you have to share what you're doing in the community? And among the organizations that we talked to, there was this general consensus around the idea that, as a leader in the community, you do have a responsibility to communicate about what you're doing so that ideally others can join you in addressing the issues. And by talking about what you're doing, you can elevate really important issues and encourage others to join you in your cause. And I think one of the keys in thinking about this is to kind of shift the way you think about your communications. So it's not so much about tooting your own horn, which is a phrase that we heard a lot. People are really reluctant to toot their own horn. But think of it less as sort of a one-way, tooting your own horn kind of messaging, but more about encouraging a dialogue and a conversation around issues that matter to the community and your stakeholders, and realizing that you're recognizing the accomplishments that you've made in partnership with the community to address these issues. And even as a small business, there's really a lot of opportunity to move the needle if you think about it. And I'll give you an example. Honest Tea, which is one of the businesses that we spoke with, they're based here in Bethesda, just outside DC. Even as a small company, even before they were acquired by Coca-Cola, because I guess they're not that small anymore, but they were able to really start to bring about some positive changes in the beverage industry because of their successes. They were really proactive about sharing and encouraging a dialogue around how they make their product and the choices that they make in sourcing materials and packaging. And some of the larger companies took notice and said, if they can be successful in this model, then maybe we can too. And I think there's real power in that. So going back to the idea of bragging, because I know this was a question on last month's webinar, we get asked this question a lot as well. How do you avoid this? How can you talk about what you're doing without sounding like you're bragging it? In particular on social media, when you sometimes have very little real estate or characters to work with, and you want to sound as authentic as possible. So I have a couple of tips for how you can kind of avoid sounding like you're bragging. The first one is to, downplay your own role in favor of highlighting the work that your nonprofit or community partners are doing. Say, we did this together, and thank them for their involvement. And on social media, this translates to, take the time to look up their handles on Facebook and Twitter, link yourselves together, tag them in posts and mention them on tweets so that, it sounds more like a partnership. The second one would be to ask them to do the talking for you. And this starts, even before you choose a partner for your different initiatives, your volunteerism. Always look for a partner who has built-in communications capacity of their own and who's willing to share in those communications duties with you. I think it just helps lend credibility when someone else is saying it for you. And likewise, the third tip would be ask other people to tell their stories so that you have their perspectives and their voices woven into the narrative. People who are a part of the initiative who can add emotion and their perspective, and it just lends that authenticity, and again, I think makes it a little bit more credible when it's somebody else saying it for you. So on to our second hurdle. Now that you've decided you're okay with communicating, you're on board, then the second thing is you have to overcome the hurdle of okay, we have to use social media, and why do we have to be on social media? And using social media in general, not just for CSR communications, but for regular communications, if you can even call it that, it's a huge balancing act already for small businesses. The organizations that we spoke to had far more questions than answers when it came to what channels are worth their efforts, how much time to spend, how often to post, how to balance all of these efforts with regular communications, and hence you see our poor gentleman here trying to balance everything as he jumps over this hurdle. So what is the case for creating this additional burden for yourselves of using social media to communicate about CSR and community involvement and volunteerism? Well, for one thing, they generally tend to be among the best conduits for creating conversation. And I was pleased to see in last month's webinar there was a poll and it said that 2/3 of the people on the call were using social media to talk about CSR, and I think that's fantastic. More and more large companies are turning to things like video to tell their stories. And even among the small businesses that we interviewed, there was definitely a trend toward recognizing the opportunity and the power that comes with video. If you think about blogs, 2/3 of large companies in a recent survey were using that medium to talk about sustainability. And why is that? It's interactive. You can actually pose questions and elicit feedback from people. So what I want to do is get your opinion now on which channels you think are best right now among the social media channels that are out there. And you'll see that we kind of narrowed it down to just some of the top platforms. But which of the following do you think are the best for telling a CSR story?
And Julie, we're going to keep this open for about 25 more seconds so everyone can get their thoughts through about which platform they think is the best, and you get to select one, so choose your favorite that you think is best for telling your CSR story. And we've got about 10 more seconds here, and then I'll close it and show everyone the results.
You'll see that we included Pinterest, and that was because there's such a huge emphasis on visuals in social media now. And what we saw, in terms of adoption rates, Facebook was far and away the platform that most small businesses are using for communications in general, followed by LinkedIn and then Twitter. But what's interesting is that when you layer that cause element on top of it, which it kind of changes the conversation a little bit, I think, about what's best for sharing a CSR story in particular, not just what's the best social media platform. So we got Facebook #1, blogs #2, YouTube #3. Great, I think that's right in line with what we're seeing. Facebook tends to be kind of the giant, the juggernaut of all communications, and it's kind of where you have to be right now. But blogs are a fantastic way because you have more flexibility and you can customize things and really use it to tell your own story. And then, of course, YouTube with the emphasis on video and how many people even use that as a search engine nowadays. You kind of have to be on YouTube.
Julie, I think it's interesting to note that nobody, at least on the line today, chose Pinterest. And I think it's similar to what I've seen is that there's been a slow adoption rate of using Pinterest for CSR. Do you have any thoughts about that, or have you seen anything different?
I think you're right in that the adoption rate's a little bit slower, and people are still trying to figure out exactly how to navigate Pinterest and what it works best for. And actually, I've been seeing there's I think, a webinar later today or a call later today that looks at how Pinterest is being used in cause marketing in particular. So there's some pretty cool applications there because you're able to track, how many times something gets repinned, and you can translate that back to a financial donation. But I think people are still trying to figure out the ins and outs of the platform and how to best use it, certainly at the large company level. And when we talked to our small businesses a couple months ago, it wasn't even on people's radar to be using Pinterest. So what's nice is that a platform like Facebook is getting more and more visual all the time. In fact, I think I read the other day that Facebook is now toying around with incorporating some of Pinterest's visual elements into their layout. So you have a lot of opportunity to use that platform to share photos as well.
Interesting.
So on to our third hurdle. So you're on board for communicating. You've embraced social media as the tool that you want to use to share your stories. So the next hurdle is, how exactly do you do this when you have limited staff, limited time, resources, and more importantly, how do you sustain it in the long run? One of the things that we heard again and again from people is that, yes, social media is not, in fact, free, and people seem kind of surprised about that. It takes a lot of work to keep up that continuous engagement that people expect. People expect you to post regular content at regular intervals, and there's a lot of work that goes into maintaining that sense of regularity. So I want to share some tips and examples of things that we saw working among the small businesses that we talked to. But first, I've got one final poll. I want to get a sense for the amount of time that you currently invest into your maintaining and building and maintaining your company's social media.
And Julie, this one should be interesting because I know a lot of the people on the line today said that they have never been reluctant to take part in social media. So I think it'll definitely be interesting to see, since they're not too reluctant as a majority, how much time are they putting into it day to day?
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to give about 10 more seconds for people to get their responses in and then show us the results.
And one thing that we saw, too, in the organizations that we talked to that's a challenge is that most smaller organizations don't have that dedicated social media manager or community manager working on their channels. It's usually appended to somebody else's job description, or it's rotated among interns. So as a result, you're not getting that dedicated time each week. It tends to be more sporadic, and when it's sporadic, it tends to be harder to see results. And when it's harder to see results, then it's harder to justify the time spent, and it's kind of this vicious circle. So it looks like everyone kind of falls on the lower end of the spectrum in terms of spending, between 0 and 5 hours per week. And it's pretty similar to the organizations that we talk to. I think on average, most of the ones that we talk to spend, maybe a few hours per week. So the question is, how do you then maximize those few hours that you're able to devote to spending the time on those channels? What are some systems and things that you can do to help stretch that time that you spend? And I'm going to go over a couple of the tips in a little bit. So our first tip, and this starts actually technically even before you start communicating, before you're even on the social media, but the tip is to align with authenticity. And the premise here is that if you are intentional and you're careful about choosing a cause to partner with that really aligns closely with your mission and is a good fit, then ultimately it will be easier to communicate down the road when the time comes. And I can give you a good example from the organizations that we spoke to. Virginia Spine Institute, which is located outside D.C. here in Reston, Virginia, actually partners with just 2 quote-unquote strategic partners, and strategic partners is their word, not mine, and I love that they call them that. The one highlighted in this particular example here is Reston Interface, and the reason that they said that they chose to partner with them is that Reston Interface mission is about getting people back to the best quality of life that they can have, and they provide shelter and job assistance and help with addictions, et cetera, kind of a full range of services. And Virginia Spine Institute said that they do the same thing from a medicinal standpoint. They get people back to that highest quality of life that they can. So they thought that there was kind of a good alignment of missions there. And they take that one step further in that their very holistic in the type of support that they give to resident interface throughout the year. They give them a variety of different things, including, they run food drives, they collect in-kind donations, they do a lot of volunteering and offer financial support. And one of the benefits of partnering in such a broad variety of ways means that they have really ample opportunities throughout the year to collect different content that they can then use for their social media. And there's a sample Facebook post here that I wanted to go through that's a good example of an authentic post. And there's a couple reasons why. First, you'll notice in the first line they refer to resident interface as their partner. They recognize that they're sort of on equal footing here, and they link to their Facebook profile, which is a nice, added touch. They offer up a, compelling photo of sort of visual proof of what they're doing. You've got the stacks of crates with the food, and they've got their employees there smiling, and the logo in the background. So it kind of, checks all the boxes of what you look for in a decent photo. They also back up the photo with a data point for further proof. So they say that they were able to provide 70 Thanksgiving dinners, so that's tangible. You can easily understand what that is and what their impact was. They thank their employees for participating, give them a nice little shout out of recognition there on their Facebook page, and hopefully you get some employees to give it a thumbs up. They link it to the season and they have fun with it, which is nice. Sharing impact doesn't need to be all boring statistics. You can have a sense of humor and have some fun with it. You see they do the gobble gobble thing there that ties it to Thanksgiving. And then finally, you can see that translates here at the bottom to a decent amount of engagement. There's a few shares, there's some comments, there's some likes, which, isn't bad. And I think this is a good example of an authentic post that, a smaller organization was able to do. So my second tip is to choose your channels wisely and to really think hard about the audiences that you're trying to reach and where they are. So if it doesn't make sense for you to be on Twitter, then by all means, you don't need to be on Twitter. And I think a lot of the smaller companies, especially the ones that we talk to, they tend to get wrapped up in the idea that, well, everybody else has Twitter, so I need to be there too. And it's better to focus on the communities that you can maintain that are really relevant to your audiences, where your audiences are, and direct all of your energies to those rather than try to spread yourself too thin on different platforms. So, after you've really considered where you should be and thought about where your audiences are, then if you do decide that you need to be on multiple channels, then you have to tailor your content to each channel. And I know that there's a temptation, and a lot of the organizations that we looked at, they do this a lot. They'll use the auto-linking feature of things like Hootsuite. You can spend a couple minutes and, all of a sudden all the content is all on all the platforms at once. And it's a very handy time-saving feature, but I have to really caution against doing this, that it's much, much better to take a couple extra minutes to just make some minor tweaks to the way that you say something so that it's custom tailored for the different platforms. And there's a couple reasons for this. One is that the lingo and the way things are communicated on the different platforms can be very different. And it's very annoying, as a user to log into, see a post on Twitter that is way too long and the link's cut off and it just far exceeds the limit, and then you see that it was auto-posted from Facebook. And likewise, if you were on Facebook and there's a really short, 2-word status update with a link that has been shortened so you don't even know where the link is going to, and there's a hashtag, that belongs on a very different platform, and it's hard to see it where you're not used to seeing it. And there's even research out there that has shown that when you post content on Facebook from a third-party application like Hootsuite, it's less likely to show up in people's news feeds. So, you're less likely to get in front of people, and certainly engagement's going to take a dive if people don't even know what it is that you're saying because of the lingo. One of the people that we spoke to at Honest Tea did a really nice job of summarizing the differences in the platforms, in particular between Facebook and Twitter. She said that on Twitter, people expect to be taken away from the site. So you'll see a lot of links, stuff like that. But on Facebook, people want to have their experience within Facebook's site. So that's why, cross-posting links from Twitter won't get a whole lot of clicks because people want to stay within that platform. Here's a good example about how just taking a couple minutes to kind of tweak the content a little bit can make a huge difference. And this is 2 posts from Honest Tea that are basically about the same story of community involvement. On Facebook, you'll see that they added an image, which is great because they have that opportunity, and also they don't link, they don't take people away. And on Twitter, they give a quick stat, they mention City Year with City Year's Twitter handle, and then they have a link for more information. So it's just a nice way of tailoring the content a little bit so that it's more comfortable for people in the language that they understand. So my third tip is to stock your CSR content pantry. And this takes a little bit of explanation. When you think about the idea of content and what am I going to put on these channels and how am I going to come up with these ideas, it can sound like a pretty daunting process. There's a lot of pressure to come up with something new every day that people will love and everybody will respond to, and you'll get tons of engagement and it will go viral. And there's a lot of pressure there. And if you think about it, there are 3.5 billion pieces of content, 3.5 billion, shared every week on Facebook. And actually that statistic's a little bit old, so it's probably even more now. But that's a lot of competition. So the best strategy to even begin to tackle this is to plan in advance. And what we saw were the organizations that were having the most success among the ones that we talked to were ones that had a simple spreadsheet or some system that they used to track things in advance so that when the time came, they didn't have to try to figure out what exactly they were going to say in that moment. They had something to fall back on. So what I like to do is I like to think of having a range of options ready to go for your content being akin to having this well-stocked pantry full of staples. So in your pantry at home, you've got things that maybe have a longer shelf life than others. You've got things that maybe take a little bit more or less work to prepare, and you've got ones that are maybe a little bit that you like a little bit more than others, that are a little bit more engaging. So we came up with this kind of handy little graphic that we wanted to help show what are some of the examples of types of content that you could have about your community involvement, about your volunteer programs. What could you have in your pantry, so to speak, with the idea that you want to have it ready and waiting when you need it. And so, for example, you've got something like a video. So a video has, a bit longer of a shelf life. It'll last for a while. People will continue to get enjoyment out of it for a while. It tends to be, depending on how it's produced and edited, it can be pretty bandwidth intensive, but it's also very highly engaging. People love videos. Photos, on the other hand, maybe have a little bit of a shorter shelf life, although still pretty good. They're maybe a little bit less bandwidth intensive to produce, especially, if you can snap photos with your iPhone and, put them online right away. And again, photos are very engaging. Something like an inspirational quote or a link to articles that maybe don't even mention your organization but talk in general about some of the issues that you support. Those maybe have a little bit of a shorter shelf life, but they're easy to go and grab from online. You post them and, articles maybe don't have the highest engagement. People love quotes, so that gets a little bit more. Questions and polls, again, maybe don't have the longest shelf life, but they're pretty easy to put together and put up on your page, and polls and questions tend to be very engaging. So that gives you kind of an idea of some of the types of content that you can start to gather and have ready to go. Oops, I'm going to stay on the slide actually. And so the nice thing is, when you think about all of your content like this, and you have sort of this arsenal ready and waiting, it also opens you up to a couple other big ideas. One is the idea of repurposing or remixing content, and that's taking bigger things and breaking them up into smaller, more bite-sized pieces. There was a great post maybe a couple months ago on Triple Pundit about taking a CSR report, which tends to be more kind of the domain of the larger companies that put out these big annual CSR reports, but how you can break that up into smaller pieces, which allows you to turn a really static kind of big one-time piece into smaller items that can be shared over time throughout the year. And the second idea is that you can combine different staples. So for example, you can take an image and you can pair it with an inspirational quote or a statistic or a testimonial and layer that text on top of the photo, and then you can share that on social media. If you ever see the internet memes that are all over the place that are a visual image with some text, people love those. People share those like crazy. So think about putting something like that together. Or you can take a testimonial from somebody, turn it into a short video that doesn't even need to really be edited all that much. So there's different ways that you can kind of combine these together once you have a sense for everything that you've got. And just a couple more things to think about, when you think about gathering and creating your content. Again, the idea of having a calendar that lays everything out in advance, pretty simply, whether it's monthly, weekly, quarterly, whatever works for you, just create a simple spreadsheet that tracks, which platform you're going to post on, what you're going to post, and when. And then you can also even add a couple columns at the end for measuring engagement, so that will give you a sense over time for what got the most likes, what did people share the most, what did people comment the most, and then you can sort of tailor going forward what you want to put your energies into developing. And then also always carry, even a simple digital camera. Anytime you're out volunteering or doing things in the community so that you can capture these impromptu videos or photos. One of the nice things about social media is that the people don't have the same standards as far as the quality, so you can definitely throw kind of a photo that maybe wouldn't meet the cover of your annual report standards, but people don't expect it to be a really fancy photo if you're sharing it on Twitter. So you should always make sure that you have a camera ready to capture authentic moments and things when they happen. So my fourth tip is to empower your audience. And when we were talking to the different organizations, it really seemed like the #1 audience for most of them on Facebook was their employees. So why not make the CSR story about them? After all, everyone loves hearing about themselves, and they love talking about themselves. So why not encourage your employees to contribute content themselves, and then recognize them when they do, and encourage them to share what's on your social media with their networks. And the one caveat I would add here is to make sure that you offer some sort of simple guidelines on, what constitutes appropriate participation on these different channels. I was at a conference a couple weeks ago, and somebody from Adobe was talking about how they have what they called guardrails for their employees on social media, and I thought this was a really great way of thinking about it. You just want to make sure that you're empowering them and setting them up to be successful, not giving them a do's and don'ts list. And finally, and this one's one of my favorites, is to embrace experimentation and have a little fun with it. Some of the small businesses that we talked to were, really reluctant to try new things on social media because of this fear of failure. What if nobody likes us? What if somebody posts something negative? What if, maybe even worse, what if nobody even responds at all? Luckily, the risk of negative comments on, community involvement stories on CSR content is relatively low. And I think one of the really kind of unique advantages of smaller businesses is that you can somewhat have more flexibility to experiment than, say, like Pepsi or a Best Buy would have, with layers of legal teams and corporate bureaucracies to go through. You have a little bit more room to try something, and it's okay if it it doesn't work out as best as you would hope it would. But there's a little bit more room to show some personality and to have some fun, and I think that was the point that came up on last month's webinar as well. Susan said, don't be afraid to have some fun with us. And this is a really great example from an organization that we talked to here in DC called Hodgson Consulting. They're a local web consulting firm here in DC. And what they did is they replaced their traditional holiday card with this sort of amped up, technologically savvy version that they sent out. So every year they send a card to all of their clients and potential clients and other stakeholders that they want to build relationships with. And this year, rather than sending them a bottle of wine or a gift card or something like that, they decided that they were going to tie it in with their longtime relationship with A Wider Circle, which is a nonprofit here in DC that Hodgson supports in a number of different ways. So rather than send people the gifts, they sent this card with a QR code on it. And when people got the card and if they scanned the QR code, it triggered a donation to their longtime nonprofit partner. So as you can see, they kind of had fun with the copy. They have this cute little poem. They tied it really well with what they do as a company. Here they're demonstrating QR codes. They're demonstrating this kind of new, fun technology to potential customers, saying, hey, we're with it. We're with the times. We know how to use this stuff. And in the end, they were able to give a few $100s as a year-end donation to their nonprofit partner. So, you know, it was kind of a win-win-win for everybody. So the final hurdle, this is my bonus hurdle here at the end, is again, something that we heard a lot is this kind of preoccupation with thinking about the numbers and the size of your following. You know, what if we only have 50 followers? How do we even begin to stack up against some of the bigger companies that have millions? I mean, Starbucks has 31 million followers or likes on Facebook. So how do you even begin to try to compete with that? And in short, I tell them don't try to compete with those numbers. What matters to your company, think about, you know, where you operate and the people that you're trying to reach and to who your stakeholders are, not trying to build up an arbitrary number of followers in regions that have nothing to do with your business. You know, think about the quality engagement metrics over quantity. And then going back to our Olympic theme here, you know, social media and CSR it's a marathon, not a sprint. So really, you know, take the time to think through what matters to you and don't try to build up 1 million followers in a month. So finally, go for the gold. And I'm happy to take any questions.
Great, Julie, thank you so much. This was definitely a really thorough overview of how everyone can get started on social media for a small business CSR communications, and really exciting. We do have a couple questions, and I encourage anyone to send all of their thoughts through now that we're kind of done with the master presentation. One thing I think we have a couple questions about, Julie, is about the use of photographs. And in particular, do you have any tips, or did you run across any examples of small businesses trying to engage either their customers or other stakeholders in actually collecting those photos or videos even? I know it's something that we've seen at VolunteerMatch, the trend of getting sort of your audiences to submit photos to you. Do you think this is a good practice? Do you have any examples of it done well? Obviously, photos are a hot topic today for this presentation.
Sure. No, that's a great question. And I have a couple of thoughts on this. One is that I actually did have a conversation with one of the organizations in our research who did just that. They were, you know, asking their community for not just photos, but you know, also anecdotes or stories, you know, words to go along with the images. And unfortunately, he was expressing frustration to me that he had not yet had success in, you know, gathering the types of content that he wanted from people. So I don't have an example of that among the small businesses that we talk to, but we actually do a lot of work that parallels this in the nonprofit sector, who face many of the same challenges as far as how to work with limited resources and, you know, tell your story in a very efficient way. And we did a big study of how nonprofits can work with imagery. And I think one of the things that came out of that was because of, you know, the use of smartphones and how easy it is for everybody to take photos now, it's a great time to be asking people to contribute content. And I think a lot of it is how you frame the ask and letting people know, you know, what it's going to be used for, how important it is, and then, you know, developing whatever, if you want to have some sort of an online system to capture the photos, you know, just make it as easy as possible. So let them know, you know, what you're going to be doing with it, why you want it, why it's so important, and then just make it as easy as you can on the back end for them to get the photos to you. So if there's like if you can have them FTP it, or if they can email it to a certain address, something like that.
Definitely, and I think something that's a benefit of kind of crowdsourcing those photos or videos from other people is it actually, I think from our perspective, it reduces the liability on the small business or on that nonprofit of getting the rights to the photos, because it's submitted as in sort of an open way. And possibly a good tip for everyone on the call is, you know, if you are on Twitter, you can get people to submit photos by using a hashtag for that photo. You know, maybe it's a hashtag around a particular event or kind of week of service or something like that. And there's ways that you can sync that up with your Flickr account in capturing those photos. So it's kind of a great way to get really authentic in the moment photos, and it also reduces the kind of the pressure on the organization to be tasked with collecting and taking all of those photos. So we have another question. Earlier, Julie, we did a poll about which channel the audience thought was best to communicate their CSR. So I believe there was company blogs, Pinterest, Facebook, Twitter, and if I'm looking at the results quickly, hold on one second. I don't know if I can show it again, but it looks like the audience saw company blogs and Facebook as the most useful. And we're curious, do you have any insight about which is most useful? Maybe it's based on the shelf life that you were discussing, but which one do you think is best for small businesses to use and kind of the most efficient and engaging?
Sure, that's a great question. I think the one challenge with blogs that maybe you have more so with blogs than with posting stuff on Facebook is that it's sort of the, if you build it, will they actually come? So you could have this phenomenal blog and wonderful content, but if people aren't actually coming to it, then it sort of exists in this vacuum. So the question is, if you're going to have a blog, which I think is great for sharing stories and sharing images, and you can actually use a blog as sort of a master portal, and you could link it. You could pull in content from other places and have it sort of be a central hub that really tells your whole CSR story. But then how do you get people to come to it? So you can link to it from your website. You can send out links in your newsletters. You can use Facebook to point back to it. But just having the blog, I think, existing in isolation is not the best use of your time. Facebook, I think, is terrific for sharing photos, and a lot of the things in that content pantry were things that you could use as a status update. You could post a video, you could post a poll or a question or a link to an article, that sort of thing. The only thing with Facebook is that you just don't have the option of customizing a whole lot. So there's a certain way that it will show up on that site, and then at the same time, there's a very limited kind of moment in time where people will have the opportunity to see it. So, if they don't happen to be really active on their newsfeed that day, they may not ever see it. I think there was a statistic that I saw, or a survey that came out that said that, most people don't ever click through to your actual Facebook page. The engaging that they do with you is all done in the newsfeed. So it kind of puts things into perspective. And now, you'll see Facebook, if you own a page, you have options to promote posts and have it, stay on people's news feeds longer if you're willing to pay some extra money for it. So they're really starting to understand the way users actually use the system. And so I think the one issue there is that you don't have as long to capture people's attention when you're on Facebook. So those are kind of the pros and cons of both of those.
Definitely, and I think it's interesting to note, as we talk about kind of testing out all these different platforms and finding out what really works and what's valuable for your organization, just the structure of how Facebook is changing, as you mentioned, you can now pay to keep posts at the top of people's pages for longer. I definitely think it's something that's worth testing, but I think it also needs to be right for your organization. Are you seeing the kind of engagement that you're hoping to see through that channel, and is it worth that investment, no matter how small it is, to kind of use that, or is your time better spent on another platform, and maybe your resources better spent on another platform? It's definitely something to think about as you get started and start testing out all these different channels. We have another question or just comment, and maybe getting some more thoughts from you, Julie, about one of the first things that you talked about was about kind of getting some of your partners, so getting your nonprofit partners to help you communicate. So sometimes I think you also mentioned in the same portion of the session that mentioning your partners, tagging them, making sure that you're kind of giving them some love and some shout outs is really important. But how do you go about asking those partners to communicate on your behalf without kind of seeming too self-serving? And do you have any tips for how to approach those partners in the right way so that they don't kind of view you as just trying to be attention hogs?
Sure. No, I love the way that you put that. I mean, I think that's the conversation too, and I mentioned that it's definitely a conversation to have when you're even kind of courting each other at the beginning phases, is to really assess, how do they communicate? Are they on social media? Are they, active? Because ideally, both parties bring, strengths to the table, and you'll be able to utilize each other's networks. And I think the nonprofit would expect that from a corporation that they're going to partner with as well. They expect to get some love and some, drive from fans and followers to their page too. So I think having those discussions early on is really key in kind of assessing, what are we each bringing to the table? What do we have to really make this a true partnership? So that way, it's not so much the small business coming in and saying, I want you to talk about us, and I want, to get some of the spotlight, but it's, let's do this together, and then on our end, we'll do this together.
Definitely, and I imagine, and I think you've mentioned a couple times that often nonprofits are struggling with the same challenges as small businesses, which is limited resources to invest in social media or CSR communication. So I guess kind of what you're saying in summary is really just sort of that lending a helping hand to each other, and kind of doing it in good faith of the partnership rather than feeling like you have to impose that requirement on somebody. So kind of sharing the love in a way.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And even, going back to what I said too about collecting photos and making it as easy as possible, you could also help, offer to help craft some of the language, or, if you have a particular person on your communications staff who's really good with social media and with, working on the messaging in there, you can, actually offer to, have some suggested tweets or some suggested status updates, and make it as easy as possible for them, knowing that they're struggling with the same, time and resource constraints that you are.
Absolutely, and I think an important part of that, Julie, would probably be, and it kind of links into my last sort of comment that I want to tease, is providing both a sample tweet and a sample Facebook post and maybe some imagery and a sample LinkedIn update or a sample of a topic that somebody could blog about. It kind of goes back to this whole idea that I think you touched on already, which is about trying to avoid the auto post. So using services that sort of auto blast the same message across multiple platforms. And it's something that we actually practice here at VolunteerMatch. We really try to avoid putting something on Facebook that auto posts to Twitter, because really they're different channels, and it doesn't work in the same way, and the same message that works on Twitter might not work in the same way. And I think you showed some really good examples of how you could get that same idea. I'm trying to remember now. It might have been the Honest Tea example, where you showed that they basically were linking to the same content, but they did it a very different way on Facebook versus Twitter. So if you do have the capacity where you're already crafting your own tweets about your CSR message, providing those to your partners can be a huge benefit to them, and also encourage them to kind of help with those best practices, which is to not auto-blast to their audiences.
Absolutely, and you could also, provide the same content to your employees if you want them to be out there on social media, engaging with people on your behalf. You could provide them with sample tweets, sample Facebook posts that, link back in the way that you want them to.
Yeah. Well, Julie, this has been really fantastic, and we only have a few minutes left. For anybody's questions that we didn't get to today, we're going to try to, we will follow up with you directly after the call. But just wanted to remind everyone on the call of a couple of things. First off, just to keep up to date with the upcoming sessions, please read our blog, volunteering@csr.org. We always post upcoming sessions and provide links to register for these free monthly events. Or you can also follow us on Twitter at @VM_solutions, where we also do customized announcements of those as well. And finally, just wanted to remind everyone of August sessions. We have an encore presentation by Carol Cohn, aka the mother of cause marketing. She gave a really fantastic presentation in May at our annual Client Summit in San Francisco, and it was so popular that we asked her back to share her presentation, The Radically Engaged Business, with all of you. So please join us next month, August 15th, with Carol Cohn. Sorry, that heading is wrong, but join us on August 15th, same time, every month, to hear Carol Cohn speak. So thanks for everyone for listening in and participating on the session today. And Julie, thank you so much for joining us and sharing all the best practices and kind of inspiring us to get started in the right way on social media for CSR. So thanks so much for joining us.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thanks so much for having me.
To everyone on the call, we'll see you next time. Thanks for joining.